Okay, and we're live again here with Crucible. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us for this session. For anyone who wasn't here 20 minutes ago, my name's Matt. I'm a partner and head of ops at Outlier, working on portfolio advisory and on our Basecamp accelerator. 20-minute session now with Crucible, who are creating a really interesting initiative, portable identity in gaming. Been through our accelerator program for these last 3 months. We run a Web3 accelerator program, incubating, accelerating, and supporting founders who are building the new data economy. Crucible have got a really interesting focus on an easy and protected way for game engine developers to access new networks of players and marketplaces. Just a quick reminder, you can join us in Slack. Will I be able to paste this in? My computer's a little slow. Let's see if I can do it. Hi, Deepal. There, here's our Slack if you'd like to join us for a chat. And we're going to be doing an interactive session right now. So please do ask any questions that you have after the guys have introduced themselves and told you a little bit about Crucible. And yeah, so maybe Ryan, Toby, why not tell us a little bit about yourselves before we dive into the idea behind Crucible and talk about that in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to the entire Outlier team. You guys did not skip a beat going remote through this whole thing, and so I know this next remote accelerator is going to go really well. So I spent about 10 years in LA working with startups and venture capital. Really kind of ended up pushing to the edge of innovation, and spent some time working with Peter Diamandis, kind of all over the world. And through that year, really got to see and meet all the people that were building the future, and realized that in a lot of ways it was already here. So that kind of it formed the thesis for what I wanted to do next, and that was in the form of Crucible.
You just got on mute. You just put yourself on mute when you start speaking.
Sorry, I must have automatically unmuted myself. I'm Toby Tremayne. I'm the CTO, obviously, of Crucible. I've been working for about the last 22 years building enterprise solutions in emerging tech. My thing really is picking up different technologies from different disparate disciplines, different industries, banging them together really hard until something new comes out. So this kind of, I've been trying to climb into the computer since I was 7. So the Metaverse is sort of, it's where I live, it's where I've been wanting to get to, it's what I've been impatiently waiting for. So when I met Ryan, things just kind of clicked and we both had the same sort of vision. We're very, very different people, but with exactly the same ethics and a very similar vision for the future.
Awesome. A lot of love in the comments for Toby. That's great. And so, guys, give me Crucible in a nutshell. What's the story?
So Crucible is a market network for the 10 million game developers and 2.4 billion gamers in the world. As a company, we exist to forge the open metaverse. The metaverse is something that has been talked about a lot this year. And if you really look closely at gaming, you can start to see it forming. And we believe that it needs to be open so that it's more of an opportunity for more people. You know, we're not interested in expanding a market so that the same companies own more of it. We really want to put the tools in the user and the player's hands so that they have agency and they have ownership in what they contribute to this user-generated metaverse.
Yeah, very much so. And game engines are at the heart of everything that's happening. If you look at what's going on online at the moment with the Travis Scott concert, everything that's happening in Fortnite, virtual worlds, meetings happening in games, school going online, the underlying tech for all of these things is game engines, whether it's that or virtual reality, even robotics. So we're really trying to get in there on that tech stack and bridge the gap between it and Web3, because gaming technology is just starting to reach maturity. And with the sort of new ventures that are going into it, the new directions that are being adapted to with game engines, it's still very much happening in its own silo. This sort of digital trust layer that's evolving around us. You know, with the pandemic, we've jumped into 5 years into the future of living online, and it's like we're flying and building the airplane around us. So this sort of digital trust layer is developing out of lots of different blockchains and self-sovereign identity and various technologies like this. And it's a difficult bridge to jump for those who are heavily invested in building their games, building their communities, those sorts of things. So really, we're trying to provide a familiar, easy-to-use on-ramp for developers to get them into this new world, while providing portable digital identity and the ability to carry your life around with you for players and everyday users.
So you touched on something really interesting there, which is that, you know, there's a lot of talk, particularly in sort of the blockchain space, about gaming, and why that's interesting, and this idea of open platforms. A lot of game developers, you hear some of the industry traditionals, a little skeptical maybe. Can you sort of give your reasoning why you think this is going to be a big thing, and why the market will flip over to this sort of open model?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are skeptical, partly because there have been several rounds of this before. You know, in the early 90s, there was a lot of pioneering work done in virtual worlds, Second Life, active worlds, these sorts of things. And they came and went. They never really created the things that they were supposed to create. They had people interested, but there were essentially subcultures. But today you can see there are billions and billions of people online, and they are spending billions of dollars on the simplest things: skins for their guns, dances to muck around in Fortnite. You know, 80% of what happens in Fortnite, a first-person shooter game, is community. You know, they're not playing the game; they're mucking around, they're hanging around, they're trading in status based on the digital content and property that they're downloading. And people are starting to understand the sort of thing that, you know, a reclusive weirdo like me has understood for a long time. How I'm seen online is something that I can control. You know, I get to both be more private and more authentic at the same time. And, you know, up until now, it's been text-based. It's been, I've had a little picture next to my name in the last few years of social media, but it's all been pretty flat. Now we're getting to a point where I can go into a world, I can put on a headset and be standing right next to somebody. And I'm starting to get to the point where I can make it look like me, I can make it sound like me, I can make it have a beard like me. You know, you get to this ability to really express yourself online and to have that direct connection with people. And I think a lot more people are beginning to experience that, some in a forcible way. You know, we're being thrust into these kinds of worlds. And the issue that we're having now is that everything is in silos. You know, I can't carry any of my life from Facebook to Twitter. I can't take my avatars from one place to another. I can't do my Fortnite dances in World of Warcraft. You know, and so people are starting to see there's all this stuff happening, but it's all scattered. You know, and we talk about the digital soul, this collective of your information, your identity, your property, your whole digital life, and it is scattered. Ryan has this great analogy that he does, which I will mess up, but it's basically, in the real world we're made up of atoms, but in the digital world we're made up of bits, and that digital soul, that representation of ourselves, the ownership of ourselves, is currently bought and sold. It's scattered in pieces around the universe, in real life and in digital life. And what we're really trying to build is a tool that sits in the spaces in between, that gives users control back, lets them manage their own data, manage how they're represented and when they're represented, who they're in touch with, and how everything is controlled, being able to take back control of that digital soul so you represent yourself wherever you go.
And we've spent the past 3 months really talking to everybody in the industry. And the developers, some of them might be skeptical, but the one thing that everyone agrees is that the player is the most important piece of this puzzle. And so there's a bi-directional conversation that happens now. And the players are the ones that want this, right? Because it's more options for them and it's more functionality for them. So the developers themselves, they need to access this digital trust layer, but there's a massive language barrier right now because crypto and blockchains are really complicated. They're regulatorily very risky. So a company like Epic would never touch Ethereum. But they want the promise of what that technology offers, right? So what we've done is kind of flip it on its head and package it in a software development kit specifically for game engine developers to be able to build an on-ramp to the open metaverse into the environments that they're building.
I'm glad you came back to that point because you mentioned the metaverse earlier in your intro, and I mean, we had a number of sort of mind-expanding conversations when we first started working together about that. And there's a big story in Wired a few months ago, and I'm just curious to sort of like hear from you in kind of layman's terms what that is and why you think that's such a big opportunity.
What the open metaverse is?
Yeah.
So the way we define the open metaverse is a creative and economic renaissance. It's the next renaissance that we'll see. And if that's a user-controlled and user-generated renaissance, then it is an opportunity for a lot of people globally. And if you look at gaming right now, you can start to see some of the early movements outside of just video games into this concept of the metaverse. And we're in a time where people haven't fully agreed on what the definition of that word is. So it's still being defined. But with Crucible, we make our case that it should be open. And we built technology so that that's a possibility.
And critically, it kind of comes back to your previous question about that skepticism. On the one hand, you've got this concept of Ready Player One, which is the dream of everything working and you wandering from one place to another. But the reality in that story is it's all owned by one company. It's all controllable by one man. The flip side is you've got game developers who live in their silos and to some extent need to. They need creative control over their games. Otherwise, the gameplay is ruined. And if there's no gameplay, there's no people. So really what we're trying to do is not homogenize things, not open the gateways so that everything can flood from one direction to another. This is why we live in what I call the spaces in between, and why our SDK is called emergence. It's all about facilitating the possibility between those things, as much or as little as necessary, but making it happen in between, not forcing every developer to implement the same standard, not making sure that everybody can do everything. It's about making the player able to be the platform, to control their relationships, to not be deplatformed or demonetized, to be able to decide how and when they contact their friends. And for all of that to live at the edge means I take it from one place to another, and every game developer can just draw from that as and when they need to. They don't have to accept other people's standards into their game. They don't have to change styles. They don't have to change all of their code. They can just open up to what they need to, start with the great security, the passwordless access, the frictionless, what we call foot traffic in the metaverse, the ability for people to wander from one place to another. And as standards grow and as people start to understand the concept of digital assets, there was some great conversation earlier about the fact that we really don't, as a species, understand digital assets yet. We really don't know how tokens are going to work and how all of this content is going to be managed. It's all very much emergent tech. But as it grows, if the user is the one that's in control, the user is the platform, then everybody else can benefit from that, and the networks grow organically and exponentially.
Awesome. Oh, right.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So I think, we've had technology take over our lives so quickly that we are now starting to reflect on that and ask questions, right? So I think what we all have to do is ask what kind of world we do want to live in. If the metaverse is what's coming next, do we want the player to be a product, or do we want the player to be a platform, right? And there are new monetization mechanisms in games like Fortnite, which are showing that skins is today a multi-billion-dollar industry. And that's not just because people love Fortnite. It's because avatars want to express themselves just like people do, because data is people in disguise, and avatars is a projection of yourself digitally in these virtual environments. So we will see the exact kind of buying behavior that we see in the real world, and we're going to see it in the virtual world as well. And so we're at a crucible moment right now to make the decision about what we want that to look like and how we want to live in that world.
Right on. Yeah, great. Hey, listen, so I mean, that's a huge vision and a very inspiring way of sort of talking about that. Can you maybe touch on a little bit about, you mentioned you're building an SDK. Tell me about the product that you're building right now and how that addresses and touches on that market, and where do you see the steps and the stages being?
Yeah, Toby, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so essentially, the SDK is an asset that drops into a game engine, very similarly to Xbox Live or Steam, or similar kinds of components. And the idea behind it, what we're trying to pick up, and what we're hoping that developers will help us shape in our alpha program, is this idea of using familiar patterns to achieve these new technologies. So we're implementing self-sovereign identity in a completely transparent and abstracted way. Our tools, think of it as a combination of a WhatsApp on steroids and a universal inventory and a universal wallet. All of these things come with you everywhere you go. So any system that uses the Emergence SDK, you can pull this up a little bit like a game overlay, or just like the inventory you'd normally have in an RPG game. So all of your avatars, your tokens, they just appear as visual items in your inventory. Your cryptocurrencies, your normal currencies, your in-game currencies, they all get managed the same way they would in World of Warcraft or anything else. We don't want the user to ever have to think about identity or encryption or credentials or anything like that. So you get walked through very, very quickly setting something up, and everything to do with wallets and crypto and encryption happens under the hood. So if you join a blockchain game, you walk in, your identity will automatically do the encrypted connections, getting you set up, getting you a secure login, no passwords needed, full KYC and verifiability on the side of the publisher. And if the publisher wants to, they can go completely anonymous, still have a direct, verifiable and accountable connection to that user without having to store their data. So the user just pulls up this digital life, the admin sort of panel for their digital soul, standard gaming style interfaces. And when you join a new blockchain game, instead of having to set up 2 different crypto wallets and understand all of that, it just happens under the hood. You've got access to it if you want, of course. That's the idea of self-sovereign identity. Anything that's truly sovereign, you have to be able to take with you. You know, if you don't like our tool, you take your data and go somewhere else. But the idea is that this comes with you everywhere you go, whether you are expressing yourself, taking your digital soul out into driving an avatar as a player in Fortnite, driving your real life avatar in a work teleconference, or even driving a robotic avatar on another platform. You should have access to the same things. You should be able to talk to all of your friends. You should be able to see your digital currencies and your items and have all of that sort of thing managed for you. And that's really what we're building.
And we're in our alpha now. Actually, one of our alpha group members is here, Stephen. The objective that we have is to make the business case for the open metaverse. So the way that will shape up is an open metaverse pilot, where we actually start to pull back real metrics on what foot traffic looks like. When there's a flow across many different environments, how does that tide lift all boats, right? How does being a part of a busy street lift business as opposed to being on a store corner on your own?
Awesome. And one key part of this that Ryan mentioned earlier is the idea of this market network. You know, and this is, again, back to your skepticism idea. If you have a look at some of the major games like Fortnite, the Bethesda games like Elder Scrolls Online, these sorts of things, they have these concepts of modding, player building, user-generated content. And the amount of hours and expertise that goes into user-created content is quite extraordinary. There's an amazing amount of it out there for free. And in some cases, games want to try and shut that down. In other cases, they want to bring it in and engender it themselves. And essentially, we allow people to create and legitimize and automate those marketplaces without actually having to build them. Again, when the play is the platform, these things exist on the edge. They get curated into a central sort of place, a little bit like BitTorrent. And so the game developer doesn't have to build all of this infrastructure, yet they get the power of the market, but the player can now start to make money out of the time that they're putting things in, whether that's game currency or real currency or like-for-like trade. So we're not talking about wealth here, but we're talking about a basic amount of income that can help sort of balance the scales a little bit.
So just in our last minute then, I just wanted to touch on you kind of what next. You mentioned that you're running a pilot program. You're keen to have some participation from the industry. Tell me a little bit about that. If anyone's interested, how do they get in touch with you? What exactly are you looking for?
Yeah, if you're a game developer that uses a game engine, we would like to talk to you. We will give you the SDK and sort of just let you play with this new functionality. It's going to open you up to a new market that's much bigger than what you have now. So you can email me at ryan@crucible.network. I put it in the chat, or toby@crucible.network. Awesome.
And yeah, I guess just to wrap up, thanks so much everyone for watching. Thanks Ryan and Toby for that that tour de force of insight into the open metaverse. I love it. It's something personally I find very interesting and appealing. Anyone who wants to connect with us on Slack afterwards, or reach out to anyone at Outlier if you want to speak to Crucible, or indeed to them directly, as they just said. thanks very much. And over
Thanks
to
very
Scott.
much.
And I'm doing a panel on the open metaverse with Ubisoft and Delphi.